Embark on an electrifying odyssey into the heart of Saudi Arabia's existential struggle. As geopolitical tremors reverberate, economic foundations quiver, and internal dynamics teeter on the edge, the kingdom stands on a precipice. Journey with us through this riveting exploration of power plays, audacious reforms, and a nation's quest to rewrite its destiny. Amidst a symphony of global alliances, simmering conflicts, and a relentless quest to diversify beyond oil, witness the high-stakes gamble that Saudi Arabia must wager to ensure its survival. Welcome, esteemed viewers, to an enthralling expedition into the profound complexities faced by Saudi Arabia in its remarkable journey. Saudi Arabia's high-stakes balancing act, geopolitics, reforms, and challenges. To ensure you're always in the loop for thought-provoking content, remember to click the subscribe button and activate notifications. Your support fuels our commitment to delivering enlightening videos like this. Over this black liquidy resource, as recently as 2018, the petroleum business in the country accounted for a whopping 87% of the government's annual budget, 90% of the country's export earnings, and a massive 42% of the country's entire GDP. This is because Saudi Arabia is known today to control approximately a quarter of all the proven oil reserves in the world, the second largest reserves of all the world's countries, second only to Venezuela. But unlike Venezuela's technically larger oil reserves, which are highly crude, difficult, and expensive to access, Saudi Arabia is only slightly smaller reserves are located under pressure just beneath the Earth's surface, and they are extremely easy and cheap to access, and they are much easier to refine. This is why for decades Saudi Arabia was the largest producer of oil in the world and is currently the world's second largest producer, just barely behind the United States. Alongside Russia, these three countries are collectively referred to as the Big Three of global oil production a day, because no single other country comes anywhere close to matching them, and they combined produce approximately 40% of all the oil in the world. But America's population is 332 million, and so most of America's oil production is consumed within the country and not exported abroad, which is why America is only the world's 14th largest oil exporter. Saudi Arabia has just about a tenth of the American population but produces nearly as much oil as it, meaning that they simply have far more that they can never possibly consume on their own, and so they have far more left over to export to other countries. Saudi Arabia is thus by far the largest exporter of oil in the world, and oil continues to provide roughly a third of all the energy that humanity collectively consumes worldwide. Countries like India, China, Japan, South Africa, and numerous European states all import enormous volumes of their own oil supplies from Saudi Arabia and are thus all heavily reliant on keeping those flows of oil continuing. For now, it is this simple calculus that has given Saudi Arabia enormous geopolitical power and clout over the past century, because they've just gotten more oil to give others than anybody else, and more than any other country. Saudi Arabia is the one most capable of influencing the global price of oil, either negatively or positively. This is because besides being by far the largest exporter of oil, Saudi Arabia also has by far the largest spare capacity of oil production, and this is what truly gives the Saudi state its unbelievable levels of global power. Spare capacity in the oil business refers to the number of oil wells that a country possesses that are not currently being used, but which can be brought online again in a very short notice to rapidly increase production. Saudi Arabia wields the largest bare capacity of oil production in the world, and they usually keep around 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day of oil production reserved in this spare capacity. By rapidly turning this spare capacity back online, Saudi Arabia can rapidly increase its globally significant oil production and dump those extra supplies onto the world market, thus decreasing global prices of oil. And by doing the reverse, by shutting more wells offline and increasing its available spare capacity, Saudi Arabia can rapidly decrease its globally significant oil production and restrict global oil supplies, thus increasing worldwide oil scarcity and increasing global oil prices. This is why Saudi Arabia is often referred to as the central bank of world oil, and it's how the Saudi state can exert significant leverage over every single country in the world, including the world's most powerful country, the United States. While America only imports a fraction of its oil supply from Saudi Arabia, these days overall oil prices in the United States can still be severely impacted by the whims of the absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia after the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. The Western world immediately passed a series of sanctions against Russia that shut that country's oil supply out of their markets, which obviously reduced the supply of oil in their markets and led to a rise in oil prices. And when oil prices rise, it tends to increase inflation in every other sector of the economy, because nearly every business in the world relies on oil at some point in time in its production process, which means that when oil prices go up, businesses have to raise their prices in order to offset their increased production costs. So after the Russians invaded Ukraine and the global price of oil shot up and inflation rates went up along with it, the Biden administration in the United States requested that Saudi Arabia turned more of their spare capacity on and ramp up production to place more oil onto the global market in order to decrease oil prices that would help tame global inflation. But the Saudis instead did the complete opposite. They ended up cutting more of their production over and over these past several months, adding more wells to their offline spare capacity and decreasing the supply of global oil in coordination with Russia, which is increasing oil prices around the world, which is enabling the Russians to earn more money on their own oil sales that is being plowed into waging their war in Ukraine, and it is increasing inflationary pressures and gasoline prices in the United States. As of May 2023, the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR, the usually massive emergency stockpile of petroleum that the United States keeps stashed away in tanks in Louisiana and Texas to release Syrian oil supply crisis, has been gradually needed every single day since the invasion of Ukraine began, to the lowest level seen in 40 years right now since 1983. Doing so has helped tame gasoline prices in the country for now, but with the reserve now heavily depleted, Washington possesses very little other options available to keep gasoline prices from spiraling upwards leading up to the November 2024 presidential election, other than calling Saudi Arabia and requesting them to turn more of their spare capacity back online, which the Saudis will surely only do if they are given certain favors. This is precisely how Saudi Arabia is able to wield its oil might and exert geopolitical influence across the entire world in the process. But Saudi Arabia's great challenge in the 21st century is that this greatest of its powers has a finite lifespan remaining, and at a certain point in the future a day will come when this power will completely evaporate altogether. Were it not for the very fortunate discovery of oil very early on into its history. For thousands of years, the Arabian Peninsula was divided between various different tribes, sheikhs, kings, and empires. There was very little to note about the lands in the center of the Arabian Peninsula, where the House of Asad first originated in history a little more than 300 years ago, in a region known as the Nat. The overwhelming majority of Saudi Arabia's current lands are completely uninhabitable. The country is, after all, the largest in the world today that doesn't have a single river anywhere to be found within it. Rainfall across most of the country's land is extremely scarce, and so fresh water for drinking and agriculture have historically been extremely difficult to come by. Across the south of the modern country is a vast desert known as the Rab al-Khali, better known in English as the Empty Quarter. It is the largest continuous expanse of sand that can be found anywhere in the world. It is nearly completely devoid of life, and it is larger in area than the entirety of France. The region of Najd deep within the interior of the Arabian Peninsula was an extremely sparsely populated and isolated backwater separated from the rest of the world by vast empty deserts and high mountains with nothing of value to offer anyone in the outside world. It was a place hardly anyone paid any attention to, and its extreme isolation from the rest of the world was partially why an extremely strict interpretation. Worthless lands of Najd in the interior of Arabia, there and then the Saud family probably would have vanished into her irrelevance, never to be seen or heard from again, were it not for the ambitions of a young man of the family, who would ultimately become known as Ibn Saud, the man who would create the modern-day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, determined to restore his family's position of power. A 27-year-old Ibn Saud in 1902 led a party of a couple dozen loyal men from Kuwait to recapture his family's ancestral seat in Riyadh from the rival Rashidi clan. It was the beginning of a decades-long campaign of conquest waged across Arabia for the young man, but at first very few people from the outside world paid any attention to it. The lands that now constitute Saudi Arabia back then in the early 20th century may have only been home to as few as 2 million people who are almost entirely very poor desert roaming nomads, and so the squabbling between two rival clans in these lands was hardly noticed by any of the great powers of the day. But things began shifting during World War I. The Rashidi clan was allied to the Ottoman Empire, and after the war broke out, the British began supplying weapons and cash to Ibn Saud, who was fighting against them, that combined with Ibn Saud's own alliance to the ultra-Sunni Wahhabi clan that provided tens of thousands of fanatical and now well-armed troops. Proved decisive by the early 1920s, the Najd region of Arabia had been entirely conquered, but the campaigns weren't quite finished yet after World War I's conclusion and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. The British appointed the Arab Hashemite family as the new reigning monarchs in three newly created kingdoms: Iraq, Jordan, and the Hijaz, which crucially included the two holiest cities in Islam, Mecca and Medina. But relations between the British and the Hashemite family quickly soured after the war's conclusion, after the British transformed Jordan and Iraq into colonial mandates and began letting Jews settle in Palestine. The Hashemites ruling the Kingdom of Hijaz refused to ratify the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, and so the British withdrew their support for the family and backed up their other Arab wartime ally, Ibn Saud, and his expanding kingdom in the Najd. Emboldened, Ibn Saud launched a new military campaign by invading the Kingdom of Hijaz in 1924, which was fully conquered within only a single year. By 1925, the modern territory of Saudi Arabia was fully under the control of Ibn Saud after more than 20 years' worth of nearly constant warfare, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. A few years later on, in 1932, Ibn Saud proclaimed the creation of a brand new kingdom over all of these lands, and he named it after himself and his family, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with himself naturally as the new kingdom's absolute monarch. The third Saudi state had been born, covering a large amount of the lands that the previous two Saudi states claims, but his new kingdom entered in a life in 1932 as a severely troubled one. The kingdom had been created through decades worth of violent warfare and conquest, and many of the lands Ibn Saud now controlled were forcefully conquered and included many people who found his alliance with the extremely orthodox Wahhabists as off-putting. Shia Muslim minority populations were found in the eastern province near the Red Sea region. Internal instability within the new kingdom was rife, and to try and preserve the peace, Ibn Saud married a daughter of every one of the other tribes. He had conquered 20 wives, and all who would go on to produce more than 100 children for him, including 45 sons, 6 of whom would go on to later rule the kingdom after his death, including the current 87-year-old king today. Saud was 60, and after decades of warfare, the new kingdom's finances were in a pretty terrible state, with nothing but a tiny tax base of 2 million impoverished people the only actually important thing. It is also going to cost an absolute fortune. Current estimates believe that the Saudis are going to end up spending more than $3 trillion on this plan to reform and diversify the kingdom. And in order to fund that enormous amount of money, Saudi Arabia is gradually selling small amounts of shares in the state-owned Saudi Aramco oil company to foreign investors, while the Saudis simultaneously need higher global oil prices for several more years to come in order to add even more money into the state's coffers before it's all too late, which is the other reason why they've been coordinating with the Russians to decrease production together. In order to keep oil prices elevated for longer, it's not that Saudi Arabia and Russia are really aligned in any real sense, it's just that their interests in having higher worldwide oil prices are currently aligned. So then Moscow has more money to fight their war in Ukraine, and Riyadh has more money to fund their crucially important reforms, but doing so is also upsetting the United States to a pretty large degree, who obviously prefers lower global oil prices, deprive the Russians of more money, and to lower gasoline prices and inflation back at home. The Saudis are currently playing a very delicate balancing game, as they must simultaneously weigh their own self-interest and need to reform or die, which will cost a lot of money and require high oil prices. The relationship with the United States as their biggest security guarantor and provider of arms, who prefers lower oil prices. Their relationship with Russia is the second largest oil exporter in the world, who can most help them manipulate oil prices to be higher, but who is stuck in a proxy war with the United States and Ukraine, and their relationship with China, who is the Saudi single largest oil customer, but who is also locked in a sort of Cold War with the United States. In the Pacific over Taiwan, it is a balancing act between all of these various interests that the Saudi royal family, led by MBS, must carefully tread between for decades, and if they ever stumble along the way during any part of it, they will all immediately die and lose everything. And at the same time, this careful balancing act must all be maintained as Iran carefully eyes them with their gains in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, members of MBS's own royal family jockey and position themselves at court and Riyadh for their own positions of power. And as the religious fundamentalists within Saudi Arabia increasingly feel that the House of Saud at large is at last fully betraying them, after the 300-year-old alliance between them and the Wahhabists is ended, internal strife within the kingdom is a certainty, and the Saudi regime is already responding to it by cracking down on emerging Islamist opposition within the kingdom whenever it can and outside the kingdom. Whenever it can, it's all a part of the very complex relationship between the Saudi kingdom and radical Sunnismist organizations with roots in the kingdom, like how and even ISIS for decades. Al-Qaeda sought to overthrow the Saudi monarchy, and its strategy to do so has been to sow as much chaos in the kingdom as possible by attacking foreigners and discouraging any tourism to the country, and attacking skilled workers in the oil and gas industry and discouraging them from coming, thus eventually leading to the kingdom's collapse by the erosion of both its oil and its tourism industries. The Saudi state has thus fought back against Al-Qaeda ever since the 1990s, but a new and perhaps even more menacing internal and external threat suddenly appeared on the scene in 2014 when ISIS exploded across the territory of Iraq and Syria in a lightning series of conquests. ISIS, too, just like Al-Qaeda, before it vowed that it would one day overthrow the Saudi Arabian monarchy after it completed its conquest of Iraq and Syria first, and the Saudi monarchy wasn't put any more at ease after it turned out that thousands of ISIS fighters had in fact come from within the kingdom and were Saudi citizens. Thus, in order to destroy the threat, Saudi Arabia sent military officers to Syria to help train and equip resistance fighters fighting against ISIS and join the American-led military coalition to destroy ISIS altogether by the end of 2014, a coalition that would eventually encompass dozens of countries from all around the world in the largest military alliance seen in history since the alliance to destroy Nazi Germany 70 years beforehand. But unfortunately, due to the inherently violent, controversial, and recent nature of discussing how an organization is infamous as ISIS was destroyed by a global military coalition, the global military coalition not only targeted ISIS's military capabilities, but also worked to disrupt its financial networks, propaganda machinery, and recruitment efforts. The battle against ISIS was not only fought on the physical battlefield, but also in the realm of cybersecurity and counterterrorism efforts to counter the group's online presence and influence. As ISIS steadily lost ground and influence, by late 2017, the group had been significantly weakened, and its territorial holdings were greatly reduced. In October 2019, the United States announced the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, further weakening the group's leadership. The decline of ISIS culminated in its eventual collapse and defeat. In March 2019, the last remaining territory held by ISIS was liberated, marking the effective end of its self-declared caliphate. However, it's important to note that even after its territorial defeat, remnants of the group continued to pose a threat through guerrilla-style attacks and insurgent activities. The destruction of ISIS by the global military coalition demonstrated the international community's collective commitment to combating terrorism and preserving stability in the region.